Sees the evaluation on screen. She's seeing my screen.
Your screen?
Yeah.
Let me see. I see the evaluation. Hi, Deb. Just to let you know, I'm in the registration link and it says, please wait. That's got to be her. Yeah, it's her.
We're underway. So welcome everyone to this final Pop-Up PD webinar of our 2020-21 season. We're glad to have you all with us. And I'm Sarah Stalker with Contact North. It's my pleasure to turn you over to our webinar moderators, Deborah Flynn and to Andrea Dickinson. And I know that Deborah is going to introduce our webinar presenter, Tamara Cottery, next. Go ahead, ladies.
Oh, thank you very much, Sarah. And it's lovely to be here and to see so many of our friends from across the province joining us today. The topic, workforce, workplace resources, and best practices, something that we're all dying to hear about and gain information about so that we can expand our libraries and our knowledge so to help the learners that we serve. These webinars, Sarah, next slide. These webinars are put together by a committee of us who are literacy networks and the Provincial Support Orgs of Literacy. And so we have them again in this year's deliverable, but we've been offering these since 2015-16. And we're very thankful to COFA for doing the French language transcriptions. So we usually have them translations. We usually have all of the webinars transcribed and then COFA takes them and does the translations. We feel that it's really important to bring you topics that are important to the literacy field. So we're always looking for thoughts and brainstorming from the field to let us know what you feel is important and what we might be able to cover for you in this. And there's an email address there that to echannel@contactnorth.ca where you can suggest topics. And the email for, or the URL for all of the resources was on that first slide. You will be receiving a recording of this as attendees, so you'll get a recording of this soon in your email box. Sarah Stalker, who is our absolute techno wizard, gets that out to everybody soon after the webinar is done. So in the next couple of days, beginning of next week, you'll probably have that in your inbox. Andrea Dickinson is joining us to help with moderating, and she'll be watching the chat function. So please use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll be interrupting Tamara through her presentation just to get your questions answered as we go along. Andrea is the ED at Tri-County Literacy Network and member of the Pop-Up PD for LBS Educators Committee that brings this series to you each year. It's my pleasure to introduce Tamara Cottery, a longtime friend and colleague. Tamara is the Executive Director of Literacy Link South Central, which serves Brant, Elgin, Haldimand, Norfolk, London, Middlesex, and Oxford counties. She has managed numerous projects that have brought us such resources as the digital literacy modules, connecting literacy and employment through essential skills, and the A-word videos that talk about the apprenticeship avenue and information about that. All of these resources and more that Literacy Link South Central has put together are on their website under resources. Go and find them. There's great stuff there. Tamara is a fiber artist designing traditional rug hooking works of art in wool. She loves crocheting. She's an evaluation specialist, a book editor, rescues kittens, plays soccer, and is the mother of 2 and married to Eric. She tried to convince me this morning that she was a skydiver, but that wasn't true. You have to throw some kind of a joke in there. Let us welcome Tamara. Tamara, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Deb. I had to amend it when Deb called me out on my skydiving suggestion. I said, okay, fine, it's belly flopping, but you know, I'm moving in the right direction.
We're going to turn off our videos for you, Tamara, so we can reduce the bandwidth, but we're going to be here watching and chat.
Awesome. As Deb mentioned earlier, Andrea and Deb will be monitoring the chat. And I really hope that you will all use the chat, not just to ask questions, although questions are certainly welcome, but even to share comments and to share the knowledge that you have about resources or anything else that I'm going to be talking about today. We really are a community of practice here, and I'm sure that some of the attendees today are pretty new to the field, but I'm also quite certain that there are some very seasoned folks amongst us, and we can all contribute to each other's learning. Okay, so where did today's webinar on workforce workplace delivery come from? Well, about this time last year, Literacy Northwest and some other provincial partners, who you'll see on the screen there, decided to make workplace workforce a focus in their business plan for 2020-2021. As I suspect everyone on this webinar knows, workforce workplace literacy has been a priority for our funder, the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, for a long time. The working group for this deliverable indicated that they would do a provincial survey of programs to find out who is doing workforce and/or workplace training and how. As part of the survey, programs were asked to identify specific resources they use to deliver workforce and/or workplace training. The resources that were identified will be compiled into a compendium of workforce and workplace resources that are available and in use in Ontario's adult literacy programs. Programs are also asked to identify best practices that they may have learned or developed. We'll be looking at the results of this survey today. No matter how long you've been in the field, it's always good to get a refresher or to learn about new resources or approaches. Next slide. Okay. So we really try to make these pop-up PD webinars as interactive as possible. In fact, before we actually officially launched the webinar, we were talking informally about some of the new and interesting tools that are becoming available to us all. We often refer to workforce and workplace literacy and literacy and basic skills programming, and often in the same sentence or breath, but there are significant differences between the two types of literacy delivery. So you get to respond to this poll anonymously. So my question is this: are you confident that you can differentiate between workplace and workforce literacy? Okay, so you'll notice that there's no option for sort of. Okay, I wasn't letting people walk the middle ground here. The key part of this question is, are you confident? So we'll wait a few minutes for folks to weigh in on that.
We're getting good responses now, Tamara.
Mhm.
We'll just keep this running while we see that responses are still coming in. Just wait maybe 10 more seconds and I can show everyone the results.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. Okay, well, that's interesting. So 33% said yes, and 67% said no. I'm just making a note of that because I'm going to be asking a couple of questions here, and we're going to compare and contrast some of the answers. Okay. Well, it's a good thing we're doing this webinar today because if 67% are not confident, then I think you'll hopefully get some answers to your question of which is which and why do they call workforce workforce and why workplace workplace. Okay, next slide, please, Sarah.
Are you not seeing it?
Oh, you know what?
Yep.
I still have the poll results in front of me, so I'll just shut those down. Okay. Much like an overall definition of literacy, there is no single definition that everyone uses. I found this definition and the one for workplace on the next slide from the Northwest Territories Literacy Council. I added the URL for the Northwest Territories Literacy Council website because if you've never checked it out before, it's very good. So, workforce literacy and essential skills are generally associated with the skills needed by those adults trying to enter the workforce. So, note that I've highlighted here, enter the workforce. By contrast, workplace literacy refers to the skills that adults who are already employed need to do their jobs more effectively, retain their jobs, obtain promotions, or move on to other work. So some of you may be thinking, hey, that describes quite a few people who come to our program. And that's true. But it's this next line that truly defines workplace literacy, at least in my opinion. Workplace literacy and essential skills programs are generally held at or near the workplace. So I want to take a moment now and hear from those of you who are on the webinar. What do you think of these definitions? And how do they compare to your definitions for workforce and workplace literacy? So Andrea and Deb, I'm going to have to depend on you to help me out with the chat.
We'll do that. Some people said that they still saw the results, so I told them just hit close because I had to do that to get rid of it. Rhonda says general versus specific employment.
So I'm guessing from that workforce refers more to general workforce prep versus a specific type of job, perhaps, Rhonda?
Looks like a similar response for Ambreen too. Workforce relates to the general audience, but workplace is more specific.
Noelle tells us, I'm not sure that I agree that workplace literacy is held or near the workplace. That's often not the case.
Okay, and I see a comment here. I think they overlap. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And you're going to see some of that come out in the responses to the provincial survey.
And Shirley's got workplace literacy could be literacy needs as it relates to a particular workplace.
Yeah, that's often how I understand it, is when an LBS program has a specific connection to an employer and comes to know what that employer needs them to be teaching to employees.
And Susie Lozo says, why is it important that we understand the distinction?
Well, that is an excellent question. So I think, as I'll talk a little bit later on in the presentation, there have been a few times, I'm going to say 4 or 5 in the last 25 or 30 years, that the ministry has come out with calls for proposals for workplace literacy, not workforce, but workplace. So for that reason alone, it might be important for us to understand the distinction between. And I say that knowing that there is still a bit of a gray area. So much of what we do in LBS to prepare people for workforce, we might also replicate in workplace literacy. But workplace literacy is also often prefaced by an organizational needs assessment, where, not always, but often, where an LBS program will go into a workplace and they'll perform the organizational needs assessment to really try to identify what are the skills particular to that workplace and to those employees that they need to be sharing.
Did you want some more comments, Tamara?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Okay.
this is good.
So
Yeah.
I think it was Joe, yeah. Workforce skills can be taught directly in the LBS program. Skills related to the workforce, workplaces directly in the specific workplace. And then Heidi wrote, I think that one may lead to the other. Once you acquire workforce literacy, you may eventually require workplace literacy.
Okay, so as you can see, it's not exactly A or B, right? I mean, Joanne and I think similarly, but probably not just because we have the same last name. It just seems one of the easiest ways to distinguish between workplace and workforce. But I think we've got the gist of it. Workforce tends to be more general. What are the types of skills that you might need to be successful in the workplace? And oftentimes people attend LBS programs directly on site at the LBS program to get those skills. Whereas workplace is often when, and again, we don't have to agree on a final definition here, but this is how I would distinguish them in my mind. And probably because I have seen the ministry take specific interest in workplace literacy, and that means delivering on site. But that could just be the definition that they've chosen to use, right? Not necessarily hard and fast and a definition that is held to be true by everybody. So again, if anybody has any further comments about the definitions, I definitely invite you to share. In fact, I see that Heidi is sharing a tangible example. So why don't we address that before we move on?
Okay, so she writes, a man approached our agency for assistance in writing his Red Seal exam.
Okay, so that's interesting. So this individual might be in an apprenticeship program. Um, oh no, the Red Seal exam means that he's already done all of his training and he's just trying to write his certificate of qualifications.
For the
So
whole country. And she writes on, I'm just going to say it to Mary, he referred to himself as a 26-year apprentice. And that's happened. Some people have worked a long time in a field where they haven't written their exams. So go ahead.
So I want to address the comment that Rianda made. So the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development is looking more to on-site delivery. Well, that is $1 million question and one that actually requires a crystal ball. I haven't heard of an imminent call for proposals related directly to workplace, but one of the things that we often take our cues from in the field is what kind of questions are we asked to answer during business planning and during literacy service planning time. So there was definitely a question that was asked in the fall of all of the regional networks who collect data from the programs. And the question was, what are you doing around sort of workplace workforce delivery? We hadn't had that question the previous year. So that makes us think, well, is there a renewed interest in workforce and workplace delivery? We have no idea if there is or isn't, but why ask the question unless there's some sort of interest? Okay. So, Sarah, you were having some distractions with your dog. I can see from the chat. Have they resolved themselves? Oh, yes. Okay, perfect. I see you've launched the second poll, or you're about to. So, with Sarah's help, we do have a second poll. My question is, does the organization that you work for identify that it serves learners on the employment goal path? And you have three choices here: yes, no, or I don't know. So we all serve 5 different goal paths in literacy and basic skills. And does your agency say that it serves learners on the employment goal path?
I apologize. The second poll does not want to open for me, and I know it's there, but I wonder if people could answer in the chat, as Tamara has a slide on the screen, and I will just close what is on this poll here at the moment. Wait a second. Now it is opening. Sorry about that, everyone.
Well, I
Now
can
I'll
just
launch it for you. There you go.
Can I just say you guys are rocking the chat because sometimes it takes people a while to figure out how to use it, but we already had like 20 responses in the chat. That's amazing. So thanks, Sarah, for getting that loaded. And we'll give people a few extra seconds here to identify their response.
Pardon the dog.
Is that Zeus that I'm hearing?
I'm afraid, yes, I'm afraid so. I will mute. Give this about 10 more seconds. Sorry, everyone.
Sarah did say before we actually started the webinar, we are talking about working from home and pets and that sort of thing. And she mentioned that Zeus is a husky and he is beautiful and he is big and he knows when it's walk time and he doesn't mind reminding Sarah. So that might be what he's doing now.
Okay,
That is
I
cute.
think you have most of your results. So let me show those to you.
Okay, so 91% say yes, we do identify that we serve learners on the employment goal path. 4% no, and 5% I don't know. Okay, all right, well, that's interesting. The 91% does not surprise me at all. I think a lot of programs have identified employment as one of the goal paths that they are serving. In fact, it's kind of hard not to, although I do think some programs still have very specific niches, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if it's acceptable to your ministry folks, it's A-OK. For those of you who don't know, it might be something that's worth knowing. So if you're working within your program, it's good to know maybe what your administrator or what your executive director is identifying, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But again, if anybody has any comments about this poll or the results, I do invite you to share them.
There is a comment here. Tamara from Rianda. We have been encouraged to identify learners as employment path, even if their first steps are secondary or post-secondary. Their final goal is employment, therefore employment goal path.
Well, that's interesting. I've certainly
Mhm.
heard that about the independence pathway, where, people sometimes when they come in, they're not necessarily ready to say, yeah, I want to have a job as a cashier, but often you hear that I just want to learn how to read and write better. And then as time goes on, then you might hear, oh, okay, now that I've learned more, I feel like, I can set a goal, I can look at my employment prospects, etc. And I don't want to get too political here, but I'll table that for now because we are going to talk about it a little bit, well, probably right now. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so why do we even talk about workforce and workplace literacy? So, first of all, you may or may not know, depending on the role you play within your organization, that literacy and basic skills is part of Employment Ontario. If you have any signage around the site that you work within, which you probably have to have, you might notice that it says Employment Ontario. This, in and of itself, is fairly telling. The ministry that funds LBS, or Literacy and Basic Skills, funds it under the banner of Employment Ontario. So LBS programs prepare people for 5 gold paths: apprenticeship, secondary school credit, post-secondary, independence, and, you guessed it, employment. Each year, every LBS program has to identify what percentage of clients in the coming year will go through each gold path. We'll talk about your crystal ball exercise, but we certainly use our previous year's data to take a stab at that. I haven't tallied these numbers up provincially, but I know in my regional network that employment is not just a dominant goal path, it is the dominant goal path. And as we just saw from our survey, 91% of the programs are identifying that they're serving people who are part of the employment goal path. From a client perspective, we know that many people access LBS because they want to get a job, keep the job they have, or get a better job. In fact, some of the other goal paths are arguably a route to employment. Apprenticeship for sure, but also secondary school credit and post-secondary. Some people pursue education for their own purposes, but most will do so for the sake of employment. I think the idea of whether you should identify them as on the employment goal path, even if their next step is secondary school credit or post-secondary, is one of those gray areas. Certainly, it'll depend on your employment and training consultant and conversations that you might be having with them. And then we have the cyclical history of workplace literacy in Ontario. From time to time, and it seems like about every decade, the ministry that funds LBS decides to explore workplace literacy, and they will fund projects to examine how adult literacy in the workplace can work. A challenge with these initiatives is that they only seem to last for a year or two, and then the funding is not renewed. The point here, though, is that while LBS programs are always welcome to provide services to and within workplaces, every now and then our ministry will make it a focus. For all these reasons, it's important that workplace literacy and workplace literacy are familiar terms to literacy and basic skills professionals, and that LBS programs that identify employment as one of the paths they prepare learners for are able to identify resources such as assessments and curricula to advance workplace and workplace literacy. So let's get to the results of the province-wide survey. The survey was actually circulated twice. The first time it was circulated, an English version of the survey was sent out provincially, and there were 76 responses. 36 of these responses were complete, and the other 40 responses were partially complete. 10%, or 7 respondents, identified as being Francophone. COFA, the Provincial LBS Support Organization for Francophone Programs, then distributed the survey to its members in French, hoping for a stronger response. They received 31 responses, 21 of which were complete and 10 of which were partial. So as Deb mentioned when she was doing the intro, I do a lot of evaluation. And when I start seeing a lot of partial responses, it raises questions in my mind. Not good questions or bad questions, but just questions. Is there confusion about what workforce and workplace literacy is? Why did people not complete? I mean, they could have had lots of reasons for not completing, but typically I don't see that amount of incomplete or partial responses. Both surveys asked for some basic information on regional network area, sector, and stream, and then went on to ask a series of questions about workforce literacy and a similar set of questions about workplace literacy. I just want to note that there was a mix of qualitative and quantitative questions. As you can see from this slide, the majority of survey respondents were from the community-based sector, with 62.9% of respondents to the survey that was circulated in English being community-based, and 57.1% of respondents to the survey sent to Francophone agencies also representing the community-based sector. However, school board and college programs also participated at the rates that you can see on your screen. So no sector was left behind. We had about, roughly 1/5. Okay, next, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the goal of the survey was to ask Ontario's literacy and basic skills programs about their experiences in both workforce and workplace delivery. We're starting here with the workforce portion of the survey. When asked, do you or your agency deliver workforce training, most respondents indicated they did not. Only 2/5, or about 40% of respondents to the survey distributed in English said they did, while an even lower percentage of respondents to the French survey said they delivered workforce training. So I just want to take a second and reflect on these numbers. So 91% of the people who are attending this webinar, at least, said that their agency prepares people for the employment goal path. But in this survey, only 40% of respondents to the English survey and maybe 15% of the respondents to the French survey said that they support people in the workforce. So does anybody else find this disparity surprising? And I guess my little red flag goes up is if your agency supports LBS learners on the employment goal path, then wouldn't you also say you're delivering workforce training?
Tamara, Deb here, while we're watching the chat to see what's coming in. I mean, your first poll today told us that some people didn't know the difference between workforce and workplace literacy. So I wonder if the language was not clear to them.
That's entirely possible, Deb. I mean, I think that happens fairly frequently where, I think we're talking about apples, but you think we're talking about oranges. And really, we're talking about fruit, but we're not all clear on these definitions. And that can certainly create a barrier.
Sure. Stephanie writes, clearly don't understand what workforce training is. Noelle said, could have something to do with who is completing the survey. Is it the ED or frontline worker? The definitions of workplace literacy and workforce literacy may need to be reviewed by staff.
I think that could be an excellent takeaway here because I want to reassure everybody, this is not a finger pointing exercise. The LBS field has been through so much in the past, I would say 15 years. And then there's a pandemic on top of all of that. So people have honestly been juggling the best they can with what they have, and I'll add, doing a fantastic job. So sometimes I think it's useful for us to return to what we think are the basics because they were really hot topics, maybe a dozen years ago. But since then, there's been so much water under the bridge that these definitions may not really be used that much anymore. And people do get confused. So where I'm coming from with part of this webinar is, in my opinion, there are tremendous numbers of workforce and workplace resources out there in Ontario and beyond. But if you're not thinking of those words when you're looking for them, you're not going to find them, right? So that's going to make it harder for programs to secure some of the resources that already exist. And it drives me, well, it doesn't drive me, it makes me sad because I know how hard LBS people work when they reinvent a wheel that's already out there.
There's a
Tamara,
few more
one other-
comments.
Okay, go ahead, Andrea.
Rianda, most of our employment clients need educational upgrading first. As I noted, we have been encouraged to look 5 years out when setting the goal path. And then Normand, as a French service provider, I'm not surprised at all. Only a few employers are French.
Yeah,
so different perspectives.
Yeah, and Heidi wrote, I suppose my perspective is a bit different as I spent 14 years in employment services prior to entering the world of LBS. It seems to me that funding through Employment Ontario would suggest that it's ultimately heading towards employment. Just my opinion. Definitions are very important. You make a good point, a great point.
Well, and sometimes it's not just definitions, it's interpretation and it's communication. So, one of my big hopes for all of you attending today is that you will know or feel that there are numerous directions that you can look in for more support in workforce and or workplace, whether it's at the definition level, whether it's at the resource level, whether it's about more of a contextual level, like where does literacy fit in this whole picture. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing the results of the survey and what was actually indicated there, as well as some other musings and having some more discussion too, because I think that's how we're really gonna learn. So
Here's a good one from Tracy, Tamara and Deb. Workforce literacy to me means computer use, knowledge of using virtual meets, communication skills required in business meetings. Workplace training means safe food handling, smart serve, AODA.
So, Tracy, I would say that probably the majority of people who responded to the surveys kind of slice it the way that you have just described. But let's get into some of the other parts of the survey. Oh, and before we do that, I have another question for you. So there are some, just have to shut my chat down, excuse me. Next slide, please, Sarah. So there are some very niche oriented LBS programs across a province, but any LBS program that says it prepares people for the employment goal path should have workforce resources on their radar, whatever you may call them. You might call them something different, maybe employment readiness or something like that. Let's take a few minutes to address this question. If you were trying to increase your program's capacity to deliver workforce training, what types of materials would you be looking to get your hands on? And I'm going to ask you to share some ideas in the chat. So it's one thing to talk about workforce materials like it's all one big basket, but really it isn't. It can be divided into several different baskets, probably as many as you like, but what kind of categories?
We're starting with specific apprenticeship materials.
I think that that's a fair division.
We've got another one, materials related to customer service, growing fields in our community, and our soft skills.
We're often asked for occupational curriculum, women's,
Soft skills, essential skills, up skills for work.
another person suggesting apprenticeship, and women's.
I see the word instructors just went by. I'm wondering if whoever shared that could provide a little bit more context for that. What do you mean by that?
We'll look for it, Tamara.
Thanks.
Customer services, computer readiness. Digital technology and soft skills. Diana writes PTP series, which supports all workforce skills. Dealing with conflict in the workplace. Specific occupational curricula that prepares for actual jobs that exist in our area. Point of sale training.
Wow. And then, I think a safe answer is all of the above. I'm still interested, well, in all of the comments that are coming through. But Sarah, I think I developed the slide so that fancy things would float in when you press enter.
Heidi writes, we need to be able to deliver training online as well. In our labor market, we're seeing many people who seek to increase their digital literacy to boost their ability to compete for jobs. And
I've got one here from Heidi. Our agency would need to increase our stock of technology, laptops, tablets, etc. So even from that point of view too.
Excellent. I mean, even resourcing your own program to be able to respond to the needs. So, Sarah, if you're still with us, I don't know if you can press enter so that some of the categories that were used in the survey will come up.
It may be my system is not compatible.
Nope, there we go. Yep, it's coming. You have to
Okay.
just keep pressing enter. You have to do it like 5 times. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I will keep doing.
This is my fault trying to get all fancy when I mean, to me, this is fancy. I realize this is fairly common for PowerPoints, but in case it's posing a challenge for Sarah, information or web resources might be a type of resources, equipment resources. So that was mentioned in the area of technology, assessment tools and resources, soft skills resources, and occupational specific curricula. So I think you guys did an outstanding job of identifying some of the categories. And of course, there's no right or wrong to this. It's sort of just a way of trying to lump together certain types of resources. And we'll talk about some of these, well, we'll talk about all of them a little bit more as we proceed. I also encourage you to think about any organizations that might be good sources for these materials. I saw PTP come up, the preparatory training program in Toronto, a
The
very
Learning
large,
Hub came up.
the Learning Hub. So certainly any of the e-channel providers, yep.
Randa says that getting our registration process and assessments securely online has been a huge hurdle for us.
Absolutely. I mean, the pandemic has, I think it was hard enough to keep up with all the changes in LBS and the environment in which we work. And then the pandemic just added a whole other layer.
Jim suggests Bow Valley and Noel contact North.
Oh,
Rianda says we are reinventing the wheel alone out here. So there.
please don't, Rianda, at least not yet. So some of the things that I'm hoping, or some of the sources you might want to think about, which we will come up, we'll talk about a little bit more later, but the support orgs. I mean, there's a reason why we're called support orgs, and those would be the 16 regional networks, your sectoral organizations, and your stream organizations, plus Contact North and Alpha Plus. And I hope I haven't forgotten any. But every single one of them, I suspect, has had their hand in developing some tools related to workforce and workplace. Yes, Centrafora, Stephanie added. Yep, great. So again, you are not alone. It's not to say that what you need specifically has been developed somewhere else, but let's first get a sense of what's out there before people spend their incredibly valuable time trying to develop something off the side of their desk, right? Because very few programs have the resources to devote people specifically to curriculum development or even assessment tool development. Okay. Next slide, Sarah, please.
It should be visible to you, Tamara.
Oh, yeah, it is. Sorry, I think I have a bit of a lag either in my brain or on my screen. So keeping in mind that for this first segment, we're focusing on workforce delivery, the Provincial survey asked respondents to identify what occupational curricula resources or websites they would recommend. And here's what people said. You don't hear as much about the ERAT materials anymore, so it's nice to see them identified here. ERAT stands for Evaluating Academic Readiness for Apprenticeship Training. And as the name would imply, these are good resources to use with learners who are seriously considering and preparing for apprenticeships. I'm going to ask if anybody on the webinar, if you know where to access ERAT resources, if you wouldn't mind posting that in the chat. The quill tasks are those that are found on the task-based activities for LBS portal. Deb, if you'd be so good as to put that URL in the chat, that would be great. Here you will find tasks for all 5 goal paths, including employment. There's a nod to Community Literacy of Ontario's Occupational Curricula series. I'm sure that you can find these on CLO's website, but knowing that Joanne is on the call, Joe, if you want to provide some further information, that would be wonderful. Some culturally specific resources were noted, as well as the Myers-Briggs assessment as a basis for discussing conflict resolution and understanding differences in the workplace. And there are a couple of mentions of self-developed or instructor-prepared materials. We know, of course, that it's very common for instructors to create their own materials, but you just might be surprised to find out how much good stuff is already out there.
Tamara, I've put up the task-based activities link for you, and Barb Glass mentioned that ERAT is now under Simcoe County, Simcoe Muskoka Development Workforce Development Board, and it's called FAST. So I'll get a link for that for you too.
Really? I did not know that. So thanks, Barb, for sharing that. Okay. So one survey respondent made mention of the National Occupational Classification, or the NOC, a federal resource that identifies the skills and the levels of skills needed for a lot of jobs and job types. I want to suggest here that for those of you who are listening, it's not absolutely necessary that you frantically write down every single resource that's listed, because we will be looking at the development of a compendium, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And anything that gets mentioned today in the chat, we will make sure is also in the compendium. Okay. So that way, you can kind of listen to some of the other stuff and not just get writer's cramp. So, a CLO, Community Literacy of Ontario, recently released a compendium of workforce resources, which is great because it means that LBS practitioners have numerous workforce resources all in one place. And we'll talk more about this later in the webinar. There are specific mentions for workforce related certifications like SmartServe and other workforce issues like health and safety. And some resources from ABC Life Literacy like Upskills for Work and Money Matters are also mentioned. And one respondent noted eChannel, specifically the Learning Hub. And it's important for all LBS programs to explore eChannel offerings from all 5 of the deliverers related to workforce development. So I could see that being a good staff meeting kind of topic. If you have multiple practitioners, do you know who the 5 eChannel providers are? Right? Do you know how to access the many, many, many courses that they have developed? And if not, that's a pretty simple fix. And last but certainly not least, a nod to the role of digital literacy. One of our participants noted that earlier in the chat, and how necessary digital literacy skills are in workforce development. So some LBS programs are using Excel, Word, Outlook, etc. Centrafora was noted as a good resource, and of course, the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework. Not necessarily an occupational curricula in and of itself, but any materials that have been articulated to the OALCF are usually more easily integrated into programming. Next, the survey asks for recommended essential and soft skills programs. You will see a lot of overlap between these responses and the responses to the last question on occupational curricula. Instructors prepare a lot of material themselves, industry-specific certifications like safe food handling. It's interesting to note here that the respondent who mentioned safe food handling noted that they do not offer certification themselves, but they assist learners in getting prepared to take this training successfully. It's actually a good topic to discuss with your local employment services programs. What certifications do they offer that your agency might be able to help prepare people for? Soft Skill Solutions was noted, which is a program that was developed by the Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board, who apparently now has what used to be called ERAT. And there are a couple of mentions for Microsoft and Microsoft certification. So these are not exhaustive lists. The purpose was to bring to you the resources that were specifically identified in the survey, but knowing that they're kind of the tip of the iceberg. So the compendium that will be developed and released soon, probably mid to late February, will have a much more fulsome listing of workplace and workforce materials. So respondents were also asked to identify equipment that they specifically use for workforce delivery. And as you can see from this list, there are numerous mentions of technological devices and software, including Zoom. Online platforms have certainly crept their way into our delivery this past year. And there was one mention of a point of sale unit. I'm not sure if everybody knows what a point of sale unit is. I'm going to describe it as a system that helps people learn how to use a cash register. But if there's somebody else on the webinar who has a better definition or maybe uses a point of sale unit, then please share that in the chat. Okay, next slide, Sarah, please. So this slide shows the assessment tools or resources that were recommended by respondents for workforce delivery. Here again, ERAT has been recommended along with assessments created by instructors. PTP, I don't know if they go by preparatory, what is it, preparatory training program? Anyway, in Toronto. So the camera assessment, which was developed by PTP, and the Common Assessment of Basic Skills, probably better known as CABS, were also mentioned. A couple of respondents noted digital literacy assessments and essential skills assessments. While just the words essential skills were identified in the survey, I suspect that the respondent was talking about tools, assessments, and training support offered through the Government of Canada website on essential skills. So the last bullet point, which I don't see actually on this screen. Well, we'll make sure that we, maybe Deb, you could look that up if you don't mind. Tools, assessments, and training support through the federal website. It's a really good one-stop place for assessment information. So here's a little fun fact. An LBS agency is expected to have a range of assessments that staff use depending on the learner's path. So if you have a learner who has identified that they're interested in the employment goal path, then technically the assessment that you use with that learner should have some roots in workforce or employment. Since adult learners who are on the employment pathway are seeking to transition into work, the survey asked respondents to identify key practices that are used to successfully transition learners to the next step of their employment plan. The key themes that this slide contains are around contextualizing the learning so that it's as closely related to the occupation the adult learner is considering. Also making sure that learning activities are kinesthetic and engaging, making referrals that are rooted in a thorough understanding of the learner's needs, offering flexible training modes, and providing a supportive learning environment. Sorry, Deb, I saw that question flash at the bottom of the screen. I asked you if you could find the essential skills, the federal site for assessment tools, if possible. If not, no worries, we'll look it up later.
Thanks, Tamara, for telling me that. I was looking up information for the POS when you were talking. So,
you probably didn't expect
like,
I'd make you work so hard or do so much when you were.
I know, I'm going like my hands are going in all directions.
Sorry, now we'll have to have 5 moderators. Okay.
Okay.
On this slide, we continue with key practices shared by respondents. A suggestion to develop a detailed training plan that is based on the National Occupational Classification Number for the profession or job the learner identifies was noted. So if you don't know anything about the National Occupational Classification numbers, that's probably something specifically that you might want to look up. Let's see, referrals to outside agencies for required certificates and making learning accessible. And here are the rest of the responses around key practices. The first bullet mentions using the job bank site for career planning, trend analysis, and job searching. However, the second bullet point, connecting with employment services, is also something to consider. You may not have a local employment services, but if you do, and since a person can be in both an LBS program and an employment program at the same time, consider working together. You know, this is where LBS and employment services meet. The last question the survey asked around workforce was if respondents had any other comments to share about their workforce delivery experience. The first bullet point is interesting. Talks about there being ongoing demand in this individual's community for workforce training. Often individuals participating are not eligible for other training options such as second career, nor does that second career funding cover short-term training. So I think that is definitely interesting because if you're newer to LBS, you may have heard about targeted or boutique training programs. We could have an entire webinar just on those. But it does kind of beg the question, what other short-term training options are available in your community for people who want to get exposed to a particular type of career? Okay, and you know, if you want to throw some things in the chat about that, please feel free to do so. But I definitely think that there is great potential for targeted programming specific to careers, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. And there's a recommendation to encourage learners to become volunteers in their chosen professional field. We hear a lot about experiential learning, not just in LBS, but everywhere at every level of learning, all the way up from kindergarten through to post-secondary. We hear about how it contributes to learning and retention, and a surprising number of LBS programs actively promote experiential learning opportunities. Joanne, if I'm not very mistaken, I know Community Literacy of Ontario did some work on experiential learning and documenting some of the ways in which LBS programs are supporting that. So kudos to Community Literacy of Ontario for that. So now we've talked in sort of more general ways about workforce delivery, but I thought maybe it'd be helpful to throw in some potential examples. So I have three of them, three for workforce and eventually three for workplace. So again, we don't necessarily have to dig into, well, is this specifically workforce or workplace? In all honesty, I made the decision about where to put them, and people may not agree. My goal here was more to show what kinds of work LBS programs are engaging in and what I would term it as. So let's see. So these examples were shared in literacy service planning reports that were put together in November 2020. So they're quite recent. So this program, and if Tracy Callahan is on today, she'll recognize this. We began working with a Ridgetown College instructor and provided digital literacy to adult learners who needed skills in this area to participate in online learning. Many were farm workers who needed to take a spray technician course due to the pandemic and were not familiar with how. And we hope to continue to do this. So in this case, and this is not the only example of a situation where LBS has kind of come to the rescue, especially because of the pandemic. So a lot of people are taking programs that used to be delivered face-to-face outside of LBS. And what they're doing is recognizing that there's that initial step that people need to improve their digital literacy skills in order to get the most out of whatever type of training they were actually planning to take, in this case being a spray technician.
Tamara, we have a comment here from Amanda. She said that she thinks she heard you talk about boutique workshops mentioned. Is that something we're actually allowed to do? I've been advised otherwise. I wanted to say that in the Learning Networks of Ontario, we changed it from boutique workshops to targeted training. And under that targeted training, we have a list of like things like soft skills or customer service. So programs are doing it. A number of programs in my area are delivering those targeted training pieces. So I think that the programs are doing it. I guess it's up to you and your ETC what you term or how you speak about it, but they are happening. And if you go to the literacy resources webpage that CLO, LLO, and Contact North have, I think they have a list of all the targeted training workshops that people are delivering across Ontario, and that you could actually call up another program and ask for, their material, talk about what they did, and see how you could do it maybe in your program.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deb. That's a great addition. I don't know why there was an aversion to the word boutique. Maybe they thought we were all selling high-end clothing or something and not paying attention to literacy and basic skills. But anyway, targeted training is alive and thriving in LBS. And I think, I can't speak obviously for all employment and training consultants, but sometimes it boils down to the number of hours that you're offering, right? So if you're offering a 3-hour program on something, then I think you're going to take some heat on whether or not you are substantially increasing somebody's skills. I mean, that's a workshop. That is not a program. And so in some ways, I think LBS has had to shift. And I would say we've not left the realm of teaching people for 3 months or 6 months, or in some cases, a year or 2 or 3. That's still a big part of what we do, because a lot of the adult learners who come to us have some significant skill gaps that they need to bridge, right? But I would say, as someone who works for a regional network, we have been encouraged for years to reach out to employment services, to Ontario Works, to employers, and they don't want programs that take years. They want short-term specific programs that will increase employability or skills on the job. And so I think there's a very strong argument to be made for offering targeted programming, if only to be responsive to the needs of your community partners. But certainly, I think there's a much greater reason, which is to be responsive to our clients. And we often find that folks who are involved in a face-to-face program, maybe have been there for 3 or 6 months. Well, if you also offer a targeted program specific to, I don't know, customer service skills or soft skills for the 21st century or whatever you want to call it, then they might come and attend that as well. Or you might have people referred from employment services just to take that type of program. So as Deb said, it often comes down to the focus on your ETC, right? What do they think is acceptable and not acceptable? But the more you know about what's happening across the province, sometimes you can make a little bit more headway in those conversations if you know that there are 10 other programs operating just like it across the province.
Hi, Tamara, and if I could just add, Noelle has pointed out how helpful it has been during the pandemic. We've been offering boutique targeted training during the pandemic. It's honestly kept us going.
Yes. And, so that in some places, people have, I don't like the word pivoted, but I'm going to use it right now. They've pivoted and they've offered more of that type of training because, it's what people seem to be able to access, right? So, in fact, our second example of workforce delivery is this. We'll just scratch out the word boutique, pretend you never saw it here. We offer targeted training such as customer service skills, cash register, complex phone skills, and bring your A game soft skills training. Employers want people with experience, so they are asking employers about their training and what they can incorporate to help their learners be more competitive for employment positions. So obviously that's an example of a program, just one program that's offering not one, but multiple programs in their community. And here's a third example. Wellington County Learning Center had started a construction helper program for entry-level jobs, but due to COVID, they were waiting to complete the practical piece of the program. The center made some last-minute changes and learners were asked to submit their designs, and the staff person cut their wood based on their designs and delivered it to the learner's door, along with all the other materials they needed to finish the project. And then the finished project reveal will be held on Zoom. So again, some people might think, well, why on earth would an adult literacy program help people get ready for construction jobs? But I think it's a great example. If you know that that's a high demand job in your community and you have adult learners who potentially could work in those types of jobs, then it kind of helps them get a foot in the door. These are not short-term programs that are replacing apprenticeship or anything like that, but it just helps people kind of learn a little bit more about tools, terminology, and that sort of thing.
Tamara, Deb here. I was in a meeting right before this webinar, and that's exactly what we were talking about. Our employment service provider wanted to put this course together to help people get work in the construction field. And we were talking with the Adult Learning Center's Grey Bruce Georgian to talk about what we could deliver in that piece that those weeks of offering that they're having for the participants. What can we offer during that time as an LBS program? And so it's that collaboration. It might not be you doing everything. Elizabeth did do it all in Wellington County, but working with your partners is a great idea.
Thanks, Deb, for raising that. It's a good example, like you said, of sharing the work and responding to a community need. So, all right, so we're going to tie off the workforce portion of the presentation. But first, there are multiple people on this call who work for support organizations in literacy. And we often sit back and think, how could we help our programs more with workforce? And so question is, what are the most significant challenges to delivering workforce literacy? I'm going to ask you to put some thoughts in the chat. And then we're going to move on. I'm going to actually address these both together. The flip side of that will be once you've had a chance to vent, which is always nice. I think venting is great. It helps you to clear your mind. We'd like to know what supports you might need, right, to deliver workforce literacy. So think about what's hard about it, and then think about what you might need to do it better, to do it at all, to do more of it. And please share those thoughts in the chat.
while they're doing that, Tamara, we've had a few comments about getting pushback from learners who always have to answer all the questions on an intake form, short
Mhm.
training session. And also another person commented that we're told not to do them because each learner had to have a fully individualized training plan. And in any given group, some would not need at least one piece of the boutique with, you know, quotation marks around it, training, and therefore they should only be used to recruit new LBS learners. So there is
I've
some back and forth
absolutely,
about it.
I've definitely heard of programs having pushback, but isn't it interesting that there are parts of the province where programs are delivering so many of these types of targeted training sessions and really raising the profile of adult literacy, raising the profile of their agency within the community by doing so. I think the question about paperwork is also very valid because I mean the process to become enrolled in an LBS program is not small or short. So yeah, I think that what it might be worth doing, because I can't answer this as a network staff person, but to ask programs that are successfully running these targeted programs, how are they getting buy-in from learners? Because they must be subject to the same rules, right? So,
I know in our area, the employment services share the participation agreement with the LBS so that they don't have to do all the questions, like when they're working together, and then only the LBS questions have to be answered.
well,
So
that
that's
was
one way of
supposed to
doing it.
be one of the good things when Ontario Works started using the SAM system, right? Thinking that, great, if somebody went to Employment Services or Ontario Works before they came to an adult literacy program, then maybe some of that information would already be in the system and we wouldn't have to ask people to divulge it all over again, right? Sort of that bridges out of poverty approach, but
Yeah. And this is done with the actual paper documents, the participants agreement. So yeah, they share them, get them to sign off on the LBS part. I know I'm taking over your presentation here.
We'll give it your best shot, Deb. No, I'm kidding. So is there anything coming out of the chat, either in terms of challenges or supports that Andrea or Debbie want to bring to my attention?
There's a number of answers coming in. We've got hard to find French instructors, making known what we offer to those who need it most. Sorry,
Simplifying the delivery and maintaining content that's not too basic, keeping content realistic.
also designing appropriate contact, appropriate assessment.
Somebody commented that they don't like that there's no consistency between reps.
If I had a dollar for every time I've heard that, I would be somewhere sunny on my own personal island. I shouldn't laugh because it is very frustrating, I think, for the program. Unfortunately, it's been noted the inconsistency year after year after year. But having said that, you know, like there's the value of us working together, right? So as support orgs, if we're trying to figure out what can we really do to help our programs, well, you know, maybe moving some of this conversation around what's acceptable and what's not, or you know, making it easier for programs to deliver targeted training makes some sense, right? So I'm hearing, I might call these things different names than you would, but I'm hearing communication, I'm hearing marketing, I'm hearing content and assessment. So hearing these kinds of things from you gives us as support orgs a place to start when we're trying to figure out for our business planning, what can we put in there that will really support our programs. So. Okay, well, I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I want to make sure that I don't leave anything important unsaid. So I'm going to depend on you, Andrea and Deb, to keep sharing things that you think I need to know. So, Sarah, you'll see I not so subtly combined the last two slides, so I'm ready to move on to the next one, please. Okay. So for this section of the webinar, we're going to focus our attention on the provincial survey results around workplace. Okay, so a slight brain shift here to workplace. As you can see from the figures on your screen, 1/4 of the respondents to the survey distributed in English indicated they provide workplace training, and a higher percentage of respondents to the survey distributed in French said that they provide workplace training, 37%. Now, I think it was Normand who perhaps in a previous chat sharing said something about this, why that might be the case. I found it interesting to note that more Francophone respondents deliver workplace training than workforce training. So if we have some Francophone friends on the webinar today, if you can see a reason for this, I'd love to hear it. I was kind of surprised. 39% say, yeah, we do workplace training. And I think that's great. So I can tell you 10 years ago, that number would have been a lot lower. The respondents to the survey distributed in English recommended many of the same resources for workplace as they did for workforce delivery. So I'll ask you to review these points on the slides yourself. The resource that I'd like to draw specific attention to here is the Workforce Planning Board. The regional literacy network that I work for, which is Literacy Link South Central, shares its catchment area with 2 different workforce planning and development boards. We have found them to be an excellent source of local labor market information. So if your program doesn't interact much with or have a close relationship with your planning and development board, you might want to make a point of exploring a stronger working relationship.
We have a comment here that says, I was told that employers should be paying for training.
I would suggest that if it's training that falls outside of the realm of LBS, then yes, that is true. Sometimes it comes down to whether or not the existing LBS agency has capacity. So let's pretend there wasn't a pandemic on right now and your program had already met all of the learners oh, sorry, I see somebody needs us to go back one slide. So say you already met your learner target for the year, but you still have an employer pounding on your door saying, we need this, and it falls under LBS. I think then you would probably be expected to say to the employer, I'm sorry, I can't do that unless you actually provide some funding. And I think some employers actually do provide funding. Probably not as many as we would like, but I think they do. So we did go back a slide. So hopefully it's to give somebody a chance to jot down some of what's on there. So I'll give you maybe another 10 seconds for that.
She said thank you, so you might be able to move on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The Francophone respondents, you'll see in the second half for workforce and workplace. Oftentimes I've divided the slides so that there's a response specifically from the Francophone survey. Now that's just because it made sense to me to do that. It's not in the first part, I combined the two. Okay, but I found there were a few more differences when it came to workplace, so I separated them out. So the Francophone respondents also shared some recommended information or website resources for workplace delivery that are similar to those they recommended to workforce. It shows you there is that gray area, right? It seems as though several Francophone LBS programs assist employers whose employees need or want to be bilingual. So there's also an emphasis, understandably, on grammar resources. In terms of recommended equipment resources for workplace, again, we see some similarities between what was suggested for workforce and what is being suggested for workplace. Laptops, Zoom, and other technological devices. But we also see an emphasis on point of sale training software. So software that programs can use to create a realistic sales experience for learners who identify retail as a potential employment goal. I'm sorry, I ad-libbed that. So if that's different than what's in the chat, then I would recommend you probably go by what was in the chat if people responded to my earlier request for a definition. Likewise with customer service training. One respondent noted that they don't use any specific equipment, but they do spend time explaining and teaching the concepts of the workplace. So we're going to move on to assessment. When it comes to recommended assessment tools and resources, a couple of new items emerge for workplace delivery. Some providers are accessing aptitude tests from major retail employers in the community. How are they doing this? I suspect that they're just contacting the employers and asking. However, if there's anybody on today's webinar who has secured such tests, please use the chat to share with us how you did it. I also like the Know Yourself Work Values quiz. Workplace culture and values are important for job seekers to explore. This sort of thing might often fall under soft skills. Again, it might be worth checking in with your local employment service provider, if you have one, to see what they do for job seekers. It might be easier to develop a partnership than to create your own materials. When survey respondents were asked to identify key practices that contribute to successful workplace delivery, several key themes emerged. The first one I would describe as quote unquote local, using locally sourced information. And remember the suggestion to connect with your workforce planning and development board, whose job it is to provide you with local labor market information. Several respondents also identified collaborating or referring to employment services. And another theme worth pointing out is customization. I think one of the things that can be daunting about workplace delivery is meeting the expectations of employers. Employers are very busy, and when they decide they do want training, they often want it right away. However, the most effective workplace training modules are customized to the employer's workplace and to the employees who are working there. Here are the responses from Francophone programs. Many of the same key practices are identified here as were identified in the survey distributed in English. Another key practice worth pointing out specifically here is being prepared to offer training in more than one way. So face-to-face as well as online. I think somebody also mentioned that earlier in the chat when it came to delivering in multiple ways. It's hard to develop and deliver workplace literacy in a vacuum. The survey asked what relationships with specific agencies have been useful in supporting or informing workplace delivery, and the answers varied considerably. Local referrals to employment services were mentioned. One respondent developed a relationship with Alpha Plus to get registered for G Suite for nonprofits. Community Literacy of Ontario was also identified. It's important not to forget that many LBS support organizations have developed materials and approaches for workplace and workforce delivery, right? So the other sectoral organizations like KESBA, the CSC, Barb is on the line or on the webinar rather today, Lawback Literacy Ontario, and all of the regional networks. Again, you're not on your own, right? Sometimes it feels that way, and it certainly feels that way right now, thanks to COVID-19. And here are the responses from the Francophone agencies. So Stardust Technologies was noted, and I actually looked them up, and boy, they seem like an incredible organization, very advanced and progressive. And here again, we see the focus on assisting companies in training staff to be bilingual. Two survey respondents identified some additional comments about workplace delivery. We've talked a bit about the first one, how critical that relationship is with the employer. Not just establishing the relationship in the first place, but recognizing that most businesses are conducted differently than we conduct our business in the not-for-profit sector. Time is money, and employers are often more interested in results than they are in process or how you get there. The Francophone respondent has noted what appears to be more of a policy challenge. Francophone LBS agencies cannot provide training to Anglophones, even if the goal is to assist Anglophones in reading and writing French. This may be why, this is just an assumption on my part, Tamara Cottery, this may be why a higher number of Francophone respondents are involved in workplace training than workforce training, while the reverse is true with the respondents to the survey distributed in English. So as we did with workforce delivery, I wanted to highlight 3 different examples of workplace delivery. Okay, so the first one here is a French community-based literacy program is offering computer and digital literacy and upgrading language skills off-site, so that means off of the LBS site, at different employers as needed. So here the work is happening on-site at employers. Our next example sounds like it's quite new. The YMCA employment program is going to partner with Home Depot to provide on-site workplace-specific computer training. So it sounds like the program in question is going to tailor the computer training to realities that employees of Home Depot would face and ways in which they will use computers to complete everyday tasks. So earlier I mentioned an organizational needs assessment. And I think that's the sort of thing that you would do if you went into a company and you were looking to develop something that was specifically for them. And when we develop the compendium that will be coming out in the latter part of February, there'll be a few resources listed there on how to do an organizational needs assessment. And here's our third spotlight. An English community-based agency is offering math, financial literacy, and employability communication skills at LIUNA. LIUNA stands for Laborers International Union of North America. So this is a really cool example because it connects directly to apprenticeship, and the community-based agency in question is providing not one, not two, but 3 different types of programming. And rather than have LIUNA members come to the LBS agency, the LBS agency is taking the programming to LIUNA, which just in my opinion, makes it more workplace than workforce. But, that's something that could certainly be discussed. Okay. Today we've been talking about workforce and workplace delivery in LBS, and we focus primarily on the practical resources that are used by LBS programs for assessment, curricula, soft skills, etc., and key practices and relationships. Employment services have been identified as a potential partner, but let's dig a bit deeper here. We mentioned earlier that LBS programs are funded as part of Employment Ontario. Employment Ontario also funds employment services and apprenticeship. Since we're all funded under the same umbrella, we might assume we have some commonalities, and we do. Together, we prepare people for employment. I want to mention these 3 programs that are also funded through the Ministry of Labour Training and Skills Development: Pre-Apprenticeship, Skills Advance Ontario, and Youth Job Connect. I encourage each of you on today's webinar to find out where these programs have been funded in your local area. Perhaps these are topics at your local literacy service planning meetings. Maybe you don't sit at these meetings because you are an instructor and your manager or executive director represents your agency at literacy service planning. If this is the case, maybe a discussion of these programs and how your agency could support them could be a topic at your next staff meeting. LBS fits with all 3 of these programs very nicely, and there are opportunities for both workforce and workplace delivery. If you're like many LBS practitioners, you may feel a little out of your depth in terms of reaching out to workplaces, but maybe you don't have to do all the work. Most planning and development boards ask employers questions about skills and upgrading in their Employment One surveys. Perhaps you could ask your planning board to share this information so you know which employers might be more receptive to being approached about skill development. Many workforce planning and development boards have also surveyed employers in light of the pandemic. Both of the planning boards in my catchment area did, and they dug a lot more deeply into what kinds of skills employers need: digital, foundational, soft skills, etc. This information, especially the digital literacy information, could pave the way for a relationship with local employers. Before approaching employers, I would strongly recommend talking to your regional literacy network. Some networks already have plans to reach out to employers on behalf of their LBS programs. As we discussed earlier, for employers, time is money. They don't want 5 different calls or visits from LBS providers, and coordinated outreach is appreciated. And last but not least, I mentioned that the planning boards can be good sources of information on which types of entry-level jobs are most in demand in your area. Some literacy service planning groups invite their planning boards to present on this data so that LBS providers can discuss whether they have curriculum that could prepare learners for employment in these sectors, or at least familiarize learners with terminology and expectations associated with the sector. So much like we did with workforce literacy, I think we can probably combine the next 2 slides. So what are the challenges that you think your program experiences in delivering workplace literacy? And what kind of supports do you think you might need in order to be more successful in this area? And it's not to suggest for a moment that every single program needs to be involved in workplace literacy. I think this is another valuable function of literacy service planning. It could be that only 1 or 2 programs in your area, if you're from an urban area, really have the resources to effectively deliver workplace literacy. Okay, so in that case, it can become a part of a community conversation. And that can actually be a huge relief to some programs to say, you know what? I don't have the ability, the resources. I've got my hands full just thinking about workforce. Thank you very much. So,
We have a couple comments, Tamara.
okay.
This is where things get dodgy, i.e. the Home Depot training. It is difficult to frame the whole thing under the OALCF. And then also in rural areas, workplaces are very small. So there's a couple challenges.
Just maybe related to the places being small. I remember a long time ago, like I think it was 1995. I was working in Peterborough, and Peterborough has some large employers, but it also had a lot of smaller employers at the time. And no single employer seemed to have enough employees, say, to run a digital literacy program. And so, because we were able to access workplace literacy funding, we were able to pay for somebody to coordinate that. So if you had 3 employees from company A and 6 from B and 2 from C, you could bring them together and deliver computer training in a cost effective way. That, I would say, that kind of coordination would be really hard for any individual LBS program to pull off. But I hear what you're saying. Yeah, small workplaces with small numbers, it may make more sense for them to refer to you, right? They've got an individual who needs to upgrade his or her skills, and they come to the LBS program.
This is a good one about selling our services, getting the word out to employers about what we can offer. So that can be a challenge.
Absolutely. And I think I saw at least one network, I think it's the Hamilton Network, is looking at doing a more concerted outreach to employers. And in that case, it's a nice way for the regional network to work together with the LBS agencies, because that kind of wide scale marketing is beyond the ability of many of our programs, right? If that's what I think that person was saying in the chat. So certainly those are some of the challenges, but what about supports? Like if you had to do workplace literacy, and you don't, but if you had to, what would you need more of? Do you feel you have enough information on organizational needs assessments, for example? Like what are they and how would I do it? I know for myself, even though I've worked closely with workforce planning boards for quite some time, employers are very, very different. I've spent my whole life working in the nonprofit sector, and the way I think about our work and the way I do our work is different. And I think there have been instances where kind of, I haven't recognized that enough. So, okay, I see we are getting very close to our time. So I just wanted to mention numerous times I've said, hey, we're working on a compendium, and compendium is not necessarily a word that gets used every day. But basically, we want to build upon this is because of the deliverable that spawned the provincial survey in the first place. We recognize that having to go to 20 different websites and scan them and pull information together is laborious. So we would like to do some of that work for you. And Literacy Northwest is taking the lead on this. And so they're going to be pulling together resources from a wide variety of organizations in Ontario and some beyond Ontario. Some of those national organizations have pretty good foot in workplace workforce. So that should be coming to you in mid to late February. So we will move on now to an official Q&A, but I'm thrilled that people have been using the chat so much, because why hold it all in until the end? It's just not good for people.
And
Okay.
there is a comment here about merging OALCF requirements with on-the-ground reality. Clarity from the ministry would help. We would do this a lot more if we could figure out how to marry those two requirements.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's had a good hard look at the OALCF since like about 2012. So I think it's time that that happened. I mean, what I think is largely immaterial in the scheme of things, but I agree. I feel like, if this is something that employers need, that our minister and our ministry would like us to try to do more of, then some of these obstacles have to be overcome. Okay, so Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, if you haven't already, I'm sorry I'm not reading the chat, but I know this is the point in the webinar when people who don't have any questions might start to drop off. And so we would really, really appreciate your feedback. If you would complete the evaluation, that would be fantastic. And it should only take about 3 minutes of your time, and your name will be entered if you choose to leave it with your email address for a $25 gift card draw. So that's pretty cool. Who doesn't want to win 25 bucks?
And
So-
Tamara, I just want to confirm that I have this as the exit URL, and I'm also going to circulate it in our post-webinar messaging. But as you've all discerned, I've been having some issues with my mouse, and I am I am unable to move screens right now to grab it. So if you can have faith that I will definitely push it out. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so are there any questions?
Lots of thank yous are coming up, Tamara. You've done a great job today. It's wonderful. Thank you. And I just want to reiterate that we have the pop-up PD webinars in our business plans for next year. So we will be bringing you more items that are responsive to the needs of the field. More thank yous and more mercis.
Well, I'd just like to thank the Pop-Up PD Committee. I'd like to thank everybody who attended today. I'd like to thank Andrea and Deb, who had to work a lot harder than they probably envisioned they would today. And thank you, Sarah and Contact North, for the tech support. So yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful day. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes in case any actual questions come through. But thanks so much, everybody, for all that you do.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara. It was lovely. It was a great webinar, and people are, anxiously awaiting the compendium that's come up in the chat. So
Good.
yeah.
I guess now I can actually look at the chat since I okay. All right. I think people might be questioned out, perhaps. But there's a lot of information to talk about for sure when it comes to workplace and workforce. So
This will be a presentation they'll probably go back and review again, just, to catch up some of the things that you told us today. It's an excellent presentation.
well, thank you very much. And it was my pleasure.
Jim had a question about the Learning Hub and Good Learning Anywhere to get away with one session seminars. I think it's, they deliver online, so they have to take into consideration that they would have short sessions that they could deal, but it's different. And they have a lot more clients that they have to serve. I don't know if any of you know, but the Learning Hub has to serve 3,000 clients in a year, 3,000 learners in a year.
Well, I will say that I wasn't aware that they had one session workshops. I thought that they primarily offered, so it might be like it's a session once a week for 8 weeks or something like that. But I could be wrong. I'll check into that because I was kind of under the impression they were under the same restrictions that we were doing face to face. But again, I'm not as aware of that. I should check into it. So.
Well, the thing is with the Learning Hub is that a practitioner could refer a client to go in and take one session on dividing fractions.
So in that
and
case,
not have to
yeah.
take like whole 8 weeks, right? So very targeted training for them to do that.
Well,
I'm glad.
Sarah, I'm sorry. I just wondered if I could jump in to say that it also is often the case that learners may only be taking 1 hour in a live session. They may be doing much more in what's called asynchronous or anytime training that perhaps isn't as much in the spotlight, Jim.
Excellent point, Sarah. This is Anne-Marie. And there's also many blended learners as well, too. So they're participating with a on-site program and then being referred to online for specific areas of knowledge that perhaps the on-site agency doesn't have the capacity to serve. So that explains why sometimes there are one-session events that learners access online.
And then there may be an opportunity just to cover a topic that is, that they've heard from their learners that they would really like to hear about. And so they offer this one session that they can go to, but it expands and links to so many things they're doing elsewhere and in maybe a face-to-face program. Yep.
Well, thanks, guys.
You're
for
welcome,
laying
Jim.
that.
Thank you for listening to us batter that out in our brains and think about it.
Yeah, that's fine with me, Sarah. No worries.